Alan and Sean here from the Prancing Pony Podcast, welcoming you to the Tolkien Experience Podcast.
The Tolkien Experience Podcast is an attempt to bring the fan and scholarly communities together around our shared passion, the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. Each episode features a notable scholar or member of the fan community sharing their Tolkien experience.
And now we'll send you over to Sarah and Luke.
Thanks, Alan. I'm Luke Shelton.
And I'm Sarah Brown.
Every other week, we share with you an interview of a Tolkien scholar or fan.
That's right. In these interviews, one of us asks our guest to respond to 6 questions that help us learn about their personal Tolkien experience.
We are so excited to share this podcast with you. So without any further delay, let me introduce our guest. I'm here with Dawn Walls-Thumma, and she is the creator of the Silmarillion Writers Guild, which is an excellent place for writers of fan fiction, and I'll let her tell you a little bit more of that in a minute. But Dawn, first let me say that it's great to have you here.
Thank you.
So I wanted to go ahead and ask our first question, which is, how were you introduced to Tolkien's work?
So I actually was first assigned to read Tolkien in 5th grade. I was moved into what was called an academically talented, or AT, class for ELA, or English Language Arts. And I was assigned to read The Hobbit in 5th grade. And I sort of liked it, but it also carried the taint with it of being a book assigned for school. So when I went into 6th grade, I was assigned to read Fellowship of the Rings as part of the same accelerated program. And now that I am myself a literacy teacher and a middle school teacher, I know what a ridiculously bad idea that was to assign that book to that particular grade level, at least for the whole class. I think I made it through chapter 2 before I got completely lost and vowed from that point forward that I hated Tolkien. Yes, really. Which I stuck by through college, actually, when the films came out. And I still remember very clearly sitting in the movie theater with my boyfriend, who's now my husband, watching a trailer for Fellowship and thinking, like, dang, that looks like so cool. I really wish I could go see that, but I've been saying for like the better part of a decade that I hate Tolkien, so I don't think I can pull that one off. But thankfully he wanted to see it. So we did go and see it, and that was the hook for me. And of course I immediately picked up the books, and I read The Lord of the Rings, I read The Hobbit again, and I much more enjoyed them now that I was not 11 anymore, and then picked up the Silmarillion after that. And that was really the beginning of the end for me. I've been at it ever since, and that was now, well, when Fellowship came out now, like almost 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So your story really resonates with something that I had to learn as like a really, really passionate Tolkien fan. I always wanted to when I was younger, kind of force it upon other people, like, no, you will love this thing. But then eventually realizing that, like, people need to read things at the right time for it to be good for them.
Yes.
And so you can't really, like, force someone to read something in a bad context, because then there's no way they'll like it. And so I find it interesting because you didn't like it when you had to read it when you were younger, but then when you came back to it, you enjoyed it more with that extra bit of context.
Yes. And my own choice in reading it.
Right, yeah. So do you think that it was just the context of the movies, or do you think that kind of you were a different reader the second time you came around?
So I really think the only reason I did not like it when I was a kid was because I didn't have the skills. Now that I am myself a reading teacher, I know that there are aspects of that book, which is, if you look at like a level, it's leveled for high school. So it was advanced for my grade anyway, but I was advanced for my grade. But there was just, there were genre features that, as an 11-year-old who'd never really read fantasy before, I was just not equipped to handle. I believe that if I had been, the term we would use in education is if it had been scaffolded better for me, then I would have loved it, because the fact of the matter is I was a huge nerd even then. My sister and I used to put our bathrobes on and get wrapping paper tubes and play Legend of Zelda. That was like one of our favorite games to play. So meaning I was Zelda and she was Link, and we used to take our swords and go on adventures together. So I loved that kind of stuff in video games and in other media when I was encountering it, growing up in the 80s and early 90s. But I just wasn't prepared as a reader to tackle that challenging of a text for me at the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really insightful thing to come back and analyze your own reading experience like that. That kind of leads us into what's normally my third question for the project, which is, you've obviously taken a step back and considered your different readings of Tolkien. So in that process, have you figured out kind of which one's your fondest reading experience of Tolkien?
I absolutely adore the Silmarillion, but fittingly, I actually hated that too the first time I read it, because it was billed on the book that I bought as like a prequel to the Lord of the Rings. So I was expecting a Lord of the Rings style. And again, it's the theme, and maybe it's because I'm a literacy teacher, but I had never, because my background was actually in science and psychology. That was what my degree was in, as my bachelor's degree. And I went back to school for humanities and to become a humanities teacher. But I had never really read, scriptural or, works of ancient or medieval literature, because I never had to take those courses as a science and social science major. So when I picked up the Silmarillion, I was once again completely lost. But unlike 11-year-old me, 23-year-old me saw herself as an intelligent and well-educated person, and was quite embarrassed that I had, in my own words at the time, been defeated by a book. So I picked it up and read it a second time. And then I fell in love with it, because I started to see a lot of what has really attracted me to that book, and has really sustained my interest in Tolkien and and my activity in the fandom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that kind of naturally leads into the question about, what is your favorite part of Tolkien's work? What really draws you into it?
So, continuing the former question, I love the Silmarillion above all the other books, which marks me as somewhat odd when I'm with other Tolkien fans, because I'm the one that, I've only read The Lord of the Rings a couple of times and have to look up the facts that I need to know for that. They slip my mind, and the Silmarillion I've read more times than I can count, and know all sorts of minutia about it. Within that, because it's such a broad work covering so much time and so many people. My favorite story is the story of Feanor and his sons. That has always like really attracted me, just because of like the sort of moral grayness surrounding that story. And just as being a writer myself, and a creative person who always approaches and understands best when I look at things through the lens of story, looking at their story and just seeing so much possibility and so many questions that I want to see answered, just really attracted me, and was what of the Silmarillion, of the whole book, which I enjoyed, really was what hooked me in.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like you really wanted to engage with the text and almost like a detective, to get in and answer the questions that you felt needed to be answered in a way.
Yes.
And I know that you do your own fiction writing, but you also do scholarship. Do you think it's kind of the same impulse that drives both, or is it different?
I think for me, I can't speak, I'm not speaking broadly necessarily, but for me personally, it's absolutely the same origins, which is having questions about a text and answering them. And some of those questions are served through scholarship. Like when I look at, the pseudo-historical devices that Tolkien used, like historical bias and stuff, I can look at that. I can use my background, studying research methods and all, to investigate that. When I'm looking at the motives of the Sons of Feanor in different parts of their lives, that's a little more murky. And that's where, those questions really beg to be answered in stories for me, instead of through scholarship. But they both absolutely serve the same purpose. And I would say that most of the stories that I've written based on Tolkien in some way come back to commenting or offering a critical perspective on some aspect of the text.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting motivator, because for me, The way I do my scholarship when I'm doing a study, it's less about trying to find an answer about the text so much as it is trying to kind of apply a framework that I want to see if it works.
Yeah.
It's kind of trying to add two and two together sometimes, I guess.
Yes.
But I really like that idea of inquiry as the motivator. I think that's really fascinating and a really great perspective. And so I kind of wonder, has that perspective grown for you? Is that a newer way for you to approach Tolkien, or has it always been there?
I never really felt the impulse so much with The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. I feel like I enjoyed them just as stories. They were stories that, especially Lord of the Rings, that just hooked me in. I mean, I remember reading one of the chapters, the chap when they're passing through Cirith Ungol and getting to the end, and it was a cliffhanger, and like literally like yelling like no, because because I couldn't wait to find out what happened, and I could see from the next chapter that they were back with, I think, Aragorn or something, and I just couldn't wait. And for those, I just enjoyed them much more on the basis of story alone. It was the Silmarillion, I think, because of the breadth that it covers, that it can't be deep in the way that the Lord of the Rings is, which covers essentially a year, in very great detail. It covers thousands of years in very slim detail. And so as a result, looking at that and feeling like there was a lot more, and Tolkien himself used the phrase that I've used in some of my scholarship of, that he felt like successful stories for him offered unattainable vistas. And I totally agree with him on that. That's for me too. And the Silmarillion were offered those unattainable vistas. It was, I felt like I was only seeing part of, especially the characters. Characters are what makes or breaks a story for me. And I was only seeing like one side of them through the narrator of the Silmarillion, and wanting to know more, wanting to see more of the complexity of that story.
Yeah. So it sounds like that's definitely evolved for you throughout your reading experience. Has the way that you've approached Tolkien changed in any other ways?
I think it has. There was, of course, moving from Lord of the Rings to Silmarillion, which I think took me from just being a casual fan to the point where this became really an important and defining part of my life or identity. Because I was spending a lot of time on it and thinking constantly about it, not just wanting to pick up a book to enjoy, but picking up the book to read and moving on, even when I wasn't reading, to think about it in beyond what the text had to offer. So there's that. I would say that, my own context of coming into scholarship through fan fiction, and coming into fandom through fan fiction, changed as well, because I was educated in a university writing program where genre fiction alone was a byword, much less fan fiction. So I was embarrassed by, there's a thread that repeats throughout this, a theme that repeats throughout my Tolkien story of being embarrassed or disliking something, and then eventually it comes to dominate my life. But when I first discovered fan fiction, then I was embarrassed that I was reading it. I didn't tell anybody about it, but it was giving me more and more of the story. It was providing answers to some of the questions that I had, or somebody's answers. I didn't always agree with them. So there was that evolution too, of coming to understand that I process text through story myself, and that is not something to be embarrassed about, but it's something that now, I not only accept but celebrate. So there was that evolution as well. And then, coming from being a fan to coming to see myself as a Tolkien scholar as well, when I decided to go back to school for my master's degree.
Mm-hmm.
And, started presenting at conferences, because that's what one does when one's in graduate school. And then really coming to understand that was part of, it's a weird mix. It's part of my fanish experience, but it's also, it also sets me apart in some ways from fandom.
Mm-hmm.
And so coming to understand that my own evolution of how I approach the works as a fan, becoming a scholar.
Mm-hmm.
All of that has changed over time. And of course, just the growing understanding of the complexity of just Tolkien's works in general, which never ends. Like, I still feel like I'm rereading the Book of Lost Tales right now, and I still feel like I'm discovering things through that rereading that in 20 years I've never really been consciously aware of.
Mm-hmm. So it seems to me that a lot of the people who end up becoming Tolkien scholars start out as fans. They watched the movies or read the books and enjoyed it enough that then they spent, to kind of use a metaphor like you did earlier, progressively more and more of their lives get consumed by the story.
Yeah.
And then they decide, well, might as well study this thing. I know that kind of rings true for me, but I wanted to ask, that's a great transition to undergo, and it gives you a lot more output in terms of ways to interact with the text. But you kind of touched on how it's kind of an awkward transition.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to ask, what about that transition felt awkward to you?
Well, I think that it's, when you're a fan, you're kind of accepting a subordinate status. You're not putting yourself in a place of authority inherently. You're a fan of a text. So that's kind of just how our culture defines it. Even though my own experience has been, in a lot of cases, that people who identify as fans are far better versed and more articulate and have thought deeper about the text than people who come to it from an academic perspective, initiating it, not so much as coming it from a fandom perspective. That's been my own experience. But, when you adopt that term scholar, then you're putting yourself into a place where you're positioning yourself as an authority. And that was really hard for me to do. I remember I wrestled a lot about when I would start using that term for myself. Like, is it when I get my MA? Is it when? And I finally decided when I had my first peer-reviewed paper accepted into a journal, I would be okay with calling myself a Tolkien scholar. But even then, even after that, then it was hard to say. It was actually hard to get the word out of my mouth or out of my fingers when I was typing. And I'd be like, oh, I sound so pompous. I sound like I'm putting myself above everybody else, because of course I still had my friends who, helped me become, the community I'm a part of, who helped me like learn and become the scholar and writer that I am, but are still identifying as fans. And so am I putting myself above them by, embracing this particular title for myself, even though, I had earned it. It was still hard to take that step. And, it's still something that feels uncomfortable in some contexts now to introduce myself in that way, just because I feel like it makes it sound like I believe I should be above other people who maybe are expressing themselves differently in the fanish context than writing papers for journals or presenting at conferences, but are not necessarily any less well-versed in the texts and able to come up with really compelling ideas about those texts than I am.
That so resonates with my experience. I decided I was going to go by researcher. I was just going to call myself Tolkien researcher. Because that doesn't sound like I'm elevating myself. It sounds like, yes, we're all researchers. We can all be researchers, but I just do it a lot.
I'm going to try hard not to borrow that.
I wanted to specifically ask, because we've talked a little bit about your fan fiction. I wanted to specifically ask you to elaborate on the Silmarillion Writers Guild a little bit. Kind of what process led you to start the Silmarillion Writers Guild?
So I had been reading, it was like, here comes that thread again. In this case, it wasn't necessarily that I thought it was a bad idea to start it, but it was not thought out at all. And now that I've run it for 15 years and I look back and I'm like, wow, I had a lot of courage that I didn't even know that I needed. So I had been reading fan fiction for about a year, and I had started my own story that I swore I was never going to show to anybody because I still had that sense of shame, from my training as a literary writer.
Mm-hmm.
So I was, it was just for fun. It was not going to be shown to anybody. But of course, this was in 2005, so this was immediately like post Jackson trilogy, and fan fiction activity was extremely high, but it was extremely high for Lord of the Rings. And, a lot of people were writing, what we would call movieverse fan fiction that was either based entirely on the movies or using at least significant elements, even if it was just, what the settings look like or what the characters look like, or, borrowing lines of dialogue here or there from the movies or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So there wasn't a whole lot of Silmarillion stuff being produced. It was in existence, but what I was finding was that there were a lot of groups and there were a lot of websites for Tolkien fan fiction as a huge umbrella, and then there was a tiny subset, maybe 1 out of 10 stories that was based in the Silmarillion. So I had thought, well, it would be really cool if like we had our own place. And to be fair, there was a Yahoo group called Silmfix, but right around when I got involved with Silmarillion fan fiction, then the owner of Silmfix, which was a moderated mailing list, so all messages had to be approved, disappeared and stopped approving messages. So that left really nothing.
Mm-hmm.
There were very few places for Silmarillion only, at least that I was aware of at the time. So one night I couldn't sleep. I'd taken like cold medicine with a stimulant in it, so I couldn't sleep. And I was laying in bed and thinking like, it would be really cool if something like that existed. I should be the one to start it. My stimulant-addled, sick, insomnia-induced brain, thought, wow, I have never published a single work of Silmarillion fan fiction. I've only been reading it for a year. I'm too scared to talk to the majority of people whose work I admire. So clearly, the sensible step is to start this organization, which at the time was a Yahoo group and a LiveJournal mailing list. Because I went to work literally the next day, and it was like one of the first things I did was set them up. My job was fairly boring at the time, so I had a lot of downtime. And so I set these things up, and then I got really scared, and I didn't do anything with them.
Mm-hmm.
But a couple months later, I decided to start posting that ginormously long novel I'd been writing. And so I attracted a couple people who were reading my work, and through that, they found my Silmarillion Writers Guild. And one of them, she went by the pen name of Ford of Bruin, and she really pushed me. She's like, okay, you started this. Now you need to do something with it. And I was like, but I'm scared. Will you be my co-moderator? And thankfully, she agreed. So that was really the start of it. We started recruiting from our varying friends group within the fandom. And I had, I drew from one part of the fandom, and she was involved in a completely different part. And so we brought together some people who ordinarily did not interact. And that was really the beginning of it. And somebody at some point said, you should start an archive for stories. And I said, sure, why not? I don't know anything about websites. I didn't even know how to make italics in HTML. But I got myself some books out of the library and read about HTML and CSS and learned how to do it and built the website, and we're still around. So that's how we started.
Yeah. It's a fantastic site. I must admit I'm not a huge fan fiction reader, but if I ever am in the mood to go peruse some, I'll go to your website and check it out. It's a really nice site. It's really easy to navigate and understand. Would you want to walk our listeners through a little bit of what they would find if they were to go to the website today?
Sure. I will say that the website is aging ungracefully. So it's based on open source software that's no longer being updated. So I'm actually in the process of working of rebuilding it, but it's good to hear that it's not a complete dinosaur yet. So I do want to offer that caveat that if someone goes to that and they're like, this is not at all mobile friendly or, what you would expect to see in the year 2020, then I am aware of that. And I'm actively working on it again with, teaching myself what I need to know. And it's slow going because I don't have a boring job anymore. But there's a few, I think, big pieces. First of all, there is our fiction archive, and we accept any sort of writing that's based on the Silmarillion. So we have fan fiction there, of course. We have poetry. We also have essays, and the fandom term would be meta, so nonfiction writing about the Silmarillion. We have associated with that, we have a reference section, a reference library. We have some areas that are regularly updated. We have a monthly character of biography that is probably one of our most popular things. But we also accept reprints of essays that have been, or articles that have been accepted into journals or were presented at conferences. And we have a peer review process for original articles and references. So we have our reference library. We have a monthly newsletter where a group of my co-moderators and I, we try to round up everything not only from our group, but we try to reach out to the fandom, the broader fandom as well. It was one of our very early goals on the SWG was everyone was very isolated and insulated back then on their respective groups, and we felt like it really didn't have to be that way, and we wanted to support other groups and projects, so we continue to try to do that through our newsletter, promoting other people's events and things that are happening in the community. So we have our newsletter, and we also, for people who write fan fiction, we also have a monthly challenge, a monthly writing challenge that comes out on the 15th of every month. And we put forth a prompt of some sort, like our prompt this month is actually a bingo card. So you pick a square. You can try to make bingo patterns on it using the prompts that are on the bingo card. For like stories that what would be called in fan fiction crack fic, or stories that come from a really silly premise and you try to like make it work anyway. So we have our monthly challenge as well, which is a popular and really, I would say, probably one of the parts of our site that really continues to drive it as other Tolkien fan fiction archives are dying. It's one of the things that's really, I think, keeping ours alive is our challenges, our newsletter, and how active our site remains with the amount of writing that's produced there.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So is that the only thing that you are currently working on, or do you have another project that our listeners could engage with?
So I do. I have some scholarly projects as well. 5 years ago, I had run the Tolkien fan fiction survey for a year to gather various information about people who were writing Tolkien fan fiction. Of course, this was right after the Hobbit trilogies had left theaters. So it was a unique part of the fandom's history. So another scholar, Maria Alberto, and I are working on the second iteration of the Tolkien fan fiction survey right now. We're hoping it will be put up for approval by the Institutional Review Board sometime very soon at her university. I no longer have an institutional affiliation, so that complicates things. But she agreed kindly to use her IRB to do that. So I'm hoping that will be out soon. And I love data, numbers to work with. So I'm really looking forward to that. And that will, at that point, it will become a sort of mini longitudinal project. It'll be 2 years worth of data across 5 years. And that's my hope, is that every 5 years I re-release it. And so we really get that ongoing picture of the fandom. So that's a big project for me right now. I also am getting ready to present at Tolkien at UVM, University of Vermont, on the first Saturday in April. So I'm also writing that paper, which is, the theme this year is Tolkien and the Classics. So I'm looking at one of my favorite topics, which is looking at the Ainulindale as a creation story, and specifically looking at it compared to Plato's Timaeus. So I'm working on that paper right now.
Great. Yeah, your studies in fandoms, your fandom studies, I should say, are really, really great material for what's really a growing interest in Tolkien scholarship. And so, I just kind of want to say thank you, because that's research that doesn't really get the recognition it deserves, because it's tough. It's really difficult to collate all that information and to make it into something that's presentable and readable and useful. That's a skill that not a lot of scholars train in. And so then, the people that do it aren't given enough recognition, I don't think, for exactly how difficult a job that is.
Thank you for saying that. I appreciate that.
But that is a resource that is something that other scholars can build on, and that's what I'm finding is something that a lot of scholars are doing more and more of right now in Tolkien, which to me is making it a very exciting field to get into. Is the number of resources being developed right now is just astounding.
I agree. It is a really exciting place to be at this point in time.
Yeah. So we are getting a little close on time, so I'll go ahead and roll into my last question.
Okay.
Which is, would you ever recommend Tolkien's work? Why or why not?
So I have definitely lost a couple copies of the Silmarillion to students because I'm a teacher. So, I occasionally get kids who are interested in fantasy, and I've loaned out a couple of Silmarillions now that never made it home. I hope that somewhere they're being read and enjoyed. I never mind when kids don't bring books back to me. I always think that's a good thing. So, yeah, I think I'm in a position that's kind of unique, especially, and to bring it full circle, my own story as a Tolkien fan, having started with a negative experience that was, shepherded in by the educational system. And I'm part of that educational system myself now. So I'm in a unique position to, present this work to students who would be interested in it, or to, borrow the language you use, to force it on somebody who maybe isn't in that place quite yet. And I've chosen, based on my own experiences, to definitely, encourage kids that I believe, students who I believe would be interested in it, to take it. And I always keep in my classroom a copy of The Hobbit and all 3 volumes of Lord of the Rings. I don't currently have a Silmarillion. I do have a Children of Húrin in my classroom. So I may have to get another Silmarillion, and who knows, maybe it too will walk off. But I've definitely loaned it to students and keep it available and do my best without being too forceful and making the same mistakes that were made with me as a young person, to encourage without making students feel compelled to take that step.
Well, I want to thank you again for taking the time to sit and talk with me. I had such a great time hearing your story, and thank you so much.
Thank you for asking me to be a part of this. I really appreciate it.
We are so thankful that we have such gracious scholars and fans who want to share their Tolkien experience with us and with you.
We have a lot of fun making these podcasts.
So much fun. It's always exciting to talk to fans and scholars about their Tolkien experience.
If you want to know more about the ways to connect with this episode's guest that they mentioned in this interview, we provide show notes at tolkienexperience.com. Also, don't forget to follow the podcast on your favourite social media sites.
That's right. We're on Facebook as Tolkien Experience, and also on Twitter as @TolkienEXP. So don't forget to like, follow, share, and comment, because we love interacting with you just as much as we enjoy talking with our guests. You can also follow our personal Twitter accounts. I am @LukeB.Shelton.
You can also look for me on Twitter, where I am @AaronLPalmadill. You can find the podcast on all major podcast services, including Apple, Stitcher, and YouTube.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. We truly hope that, in a way, it contributes to your own Tolkien experience.